proud to support the McLaughlin Group. GE. From plastics to financial services, we bring good things to life.
Public affairs programming continues on Iowa Public Television as we present Iowa Press with host Dean Borg, coming up next.
Iowa's commitment to high-quality education in our primary and secondary schools is getting more expensive. Budget reality is forcing some big changes in our educational system, and that'll be the case for the foreseeable future. We'll get an assessment from Dr. William Lepley today, Director of Iowa's Department of Education. But first, budget reality is producing a number of plans to solve the state's looming budget deficit, and those plans represent political solutions, which have now become a part of the public debate. Let's get the insights of David Yepsen of the Des Moines Register and Mike Glover of the Associated Press.
Mike, there are a lot of plans on the table, a lot of sacred cows, and I think it reflects a measure of how bad this situation is, that so many ideas are on the table. One of the most controversial ones is a proposal by State Auditor Dick Johnson to use the use tax revenues for the general fund instead of putting them into the road fund. If ever there was a sacred cow in Iowa, it's the road fund. And to take those dollars and to put them into other priorities really says that a lot of politicians are starting to rethink whether we need so many roads in this state.
Well, David, as you know, I'm sort of an old cynic, and I look at some of the places that I don't see plans coming from, like the legislature. I believe in political necessity. Politicians act when they feel voters have a need to throw them out of office. And there are some politicians in Iowa who may not be feeling that need right now. Terry Branstad is not up for election in 1992. The Republicans in the legislature who are up for re-election may like this mess a little bit and may not want to solve it. There are a lot of Democrats not running for re-election. They aren't going to face voters again and could care. Plus, there's another block of pretty liberal, mainly urban Democrats who don't have to worry about re-election, who sincerely believe the only way to solve this is higher taxes. And I don't think Terry Branstad will buy that.
I think maybe that's where you and I disagree a little bit, Mike, because I think that all the politicians are feeling the heat here. I think they've all got their back to the wall. People are angry about this deficit, and it means they're thinking differently. And when you have a bunch of Democrats finding an opportunity to nail the road lobby, which isn't exactly the most democratic group of folks, they may take advantage of that. It'd be great, get the deficit monkey off their back, we build a few less roads to nowhere, and they can go campaign for re-election having solved the problem.
I think we do disagree just a bit, except I think we agree on one thing, and I think we agree they're all feeling the heat and they all think something needs to be done. I don't think they understand or know quite what they want to do. Even if they decided, let's solve it, I don't think they have an answer at the top of their head.
A lot of these budget issues are related to education, and we'll be talking about that with our guests today. For Mike Glover, I'm Dave Yepsen, and that's our Insight.
Major funding for this program is provided by Friends of Iowa Public Television. This is the Sunday, October 27th edition of Iowa Press, with today's guest, Dr. William Lepley, Director of the Iowa Department of Education. Here is Dean Borg.
For some time now, Iowa has been identified as a state that has a high-quality education system at the top of its priorities list, and we've prided ourselves, justifiably so, in Iowa's top placements in the National Achievement Tests, and we're pleased with the accomplishments of Iowa school children through the generations. Inside and outside Iowa's boundaries, that's a good state identity to have. But today, our school administrators are being asked to do more with less, and unless economic conditions improve dramatically, the idea of high-quality education may have to be redefined. We look to the present and to the future today with Dr. William Lepley, the Director of Iowa's Department of Education. Dr. Lepley is in his 4th year at the top of Iowa's educational establishment as he oversees Iowa's more than 400 public school districts, some 200 private schools, and Iowa's 15 community colleges. Joining us, two gentlemen already introduced, Dave Yepsen of the Des Moines Register, Mike Glover of the Associated Press, and also joining us, Kay Henderson of Radio Iowa.
Dr. Lepley, you are releasing today something called Iowa 2000. Number one, what is it, and why should we care?
Well, of course, the National Education Forum is being held in Iowa today and tomorrow with over 700 participants, school board members, teachers, administrators from across the nation, over 32 states, about 12 governors, Secretary of Alexander. This afternoon, a group of Iowa's top educators, both at the local level and at the state level, along with Governor Branstad, myself, and a congressional delegation, we'll be meeting with the Secretary to explain how we need to transform Iowa schools and how we believe we are one of a few, if not the only state, that has key players at the table to talk about Iowa's future, its educational future, and it's been tagged Iowa 2000. And of course, we're going to try to convince the Secretary to provide some funding out of his America 2000 program to support Iowa's efforts to move forward.
Is Iowa 2000 more than we want our students literate and we want them to graduate?
Yeah, it gets at basically the structure of how school is delivered. I mean, it gets into who makes decisions, how do we give teachers greater voice and parents greater voice at their local school site. It redefines the role of boards and central offices and the role of the state and local districts.
Dr. Lepley, you're going to have a lot of people in Des Moines for a meeting. What's going to come out of that meeting? I mean, what are you going to accomplish that you can point to and say Iowa schools are going to be different because this was done at this meeting?
Well, I think, of course, we're only one of 30-plus states that are here. I think the collective agenda for Iowa and the states that are here is how do we get each local community and its citizens in their hearts and minds to adopt the 6 national goals and feel the sense of urgency in each community that we need to transform America's schools so that all kids learn at much higher levels, not just the college-bound kids, but all schools. I mean, we're going to have workshops here dealing with how we connect school and employment, how do we serve the non-college-bound student much better. So the agenda is that to bring the 6 national goals down to each community, and we believe that in Iowa we need to show the way and lead the way, and I think we have the opportunity to.
But a lot of people look at things like this and they say, okay, here we have schools, let's say on a Saturday, we have a 2-day meeting and Tuesday is here. How are schools different?
Well, I'm not sure I understand where you're going with that.
What concrete gets done? A lot of people criticize these meetings, saying that that's the biggest growth industry in the country right now. It's education meetings, where nothing much gets done except from reports that nobody reads.
Well, I think in Iowa, one of our strengths, you know, we talked about at the beginning of this program how strong our schools are. I think part of that is because we do engage all of our citizens and educators at the table to frame solutions. Education is a very complex enterprise, and a lot of people have a high stakes, high passion for what education delivers. So what we're going to do this weekend is try to develop a strategy for Iowa and the other 32 states to develop a strategy to go back home and try to redefine schools based on what each community thinks needs to occur.
Dr. Lepley, we talk about how great schools are in Iowa, but who tells us that? How do we know that? Compared to what? Compared to Louisiana? I used to say, well, does that really mean anything? I mean, I used to think that's like, you know, beating Northwestern and saying you had a good football team, but maybe we can't say that anymore. But who tells us that we have good schools? Parents are very dissatisfied with schools, and yet you educators all say, oh, they're really great.
Well, the interesting thing that's happening, Dave, in the national and state polls, and the Gallup poll, which everybody seems to put a lot of stock in, basically people think their schools are good at home. The citizens, not just educators, feel their schools are good. At the same time, our international comparisons, Iowa, by all indicators that we use traditional measures, will rank among the top states in this country, but internationally, the United States, on most international measures, which, by the way, there aren't that many, but in math and science, we rank near the bottom in every one of those categories. So we're sort of we're the best among what's considered mediocre internationally.
So even when we compare Iowa kids with the Germans and the Japanese, which is where our kids are going to have to compete for jobs, even there our math scores are not that great.
Right, that is true.
One issue that's very controversial right now is school consolidation. Some of the best test scores you get are in sort of medium-range schools. There are suggesting that some of the school districts in Iowa are too small, and that maybe some are even too big. The governor has a commission studying spending reform in Iowa. What's going to happen with school consolidation? Should we consolidate schools in the state?
Well, I've said from the day I was interviewed for this job to I think one of the first press conferences I've had, you cannot have world-class schools in education and try to maintain 425 school districts. You just can't do that. Now, what should be the solutions? I think there are lots of ways that we can approach that. The recent Fisher Commission subcommittee put out one idea. The fact is that we have 35 school districts today, literally on my desk, that are saying they want to participate in a school consolidation study. I just recently stated that I believe at the current rate of change that if no further decisions are made by the state, we'll have 100 less school districts in 5 years. A part of that is the new school aid formula kicks in, which basically sends dollars where kids are at, and that's a major change. The new standards just kicked in, and now the funding incentives, the sharing incentives in this next year, so they're scrambling. There's a flurry of activities out there right now.
The legislature has also provided, though, for school districts that want to tax themselves through the instructional tax levy to be able to do that. If you want your school district, you can pay the freight. Isn't that not a good idea, then?
Well, it is a good idea. I mean, I can't disown that one. I put together the school aid study formula that rewrote the new school aid formula. The objective is that the state ought to fund the minimum level of standards they expect. If school districts want to stay in operation and go beyond that, then they ought to fund that on their own, and that's the instructional support levy. In fact, the controversial issue of the Fisher report right now basically supports that. I don't think they realize that by when they say if we ought to raise the staff-to-student ratio from 15 to 20, and then if they want to fund it beyond the 20, they ought to fund it on their own. I'd suggest to you that's the exact formula that we have put in place. That's in operation beginning the school year.
Another controversial aspect of that Fisher report is the fact that they think there are 6,000 too many teachers in Iowa and that we have too many administrators in the state of Iowa. Are there too many administrators in the state of Iowa?
Absolutely, and there's too many teachers, but there's not too many if you're going to keep the current structure the way it is. And you cannot bash school administrators in the state unless you change the structure. They aren't there because they put themselves there. They're there because they're trying to prop up this system that's no longer appropriate for the times we're in today.
Will you, Bill Lepley, tell them to scale back? Is it a state decision to tell schools to scale back, or is it a local decision that they make on their own? I mean,
I think we have in place the policy tools today that we have put in place since I've been in office the last 4 years that basically is going to dictate the change that occurs in school the next 4 years. The question is not whether it's going to. The question is, and I think the Fisher Committee is trying to examine this, is how rapidly should it occur, not whether it's going to occur. Incidentally, the state has never reorganized school in its history. People are misinformed about that. What the state has always done, even in the one-room schoolhouses, they did not say, one-room schoolhouses, you shall close. What they said was, because they were already closing, they were responding to the demographics and economics of the state. What they said, you shall not just go wherever you want. You shall attach yourself to a school.
So how quickly should it go? Should it happen next year?
I think I think what is occurring right now with the Fisher Committee is the most encouraged I've been in my 4 years since I've been here, because we finally have the hearts and minds of Iowans taking this issue seriously.
Dave Epson, go ahead.
I interrupted you. Did you have more you wanted to add to that?
I just think that you two were having a discussion at the beginning of the show about what are Iowans thinking about all of this. My belief with school consolidation is that in rural Iowa, in the ruralmost parts of Iowa, that how people are framing this discussion is much different than it was 4 years ago. The sense of urgency, the sense of, in some cases, we have no other choice, is here. It's different than it was 4 years ago.
Is the basis for school consolidation strictly efficiency, or do you think that schools can be more effective, too? That is, are we going to sacrifice our educational standards?
I would not push school consolidation if it was not a quality issue. If it was just efficiency, I figure that's not my problem alone.
Open enrollment, to a certain extent, the plan where a student can go into an adjacent district, was designed also to penalize those districts that weren't serving their students, I think, and to allow them to go where they could be better served. Has that not been working to penalize those districts and put them out of business?
The school districts that are most quickly moving to whole grade sharing or consolidation have the highest percentage of open enrollments of their students in the state. So there's a strong correlation.
Dr. Lepley, one of the things the Fisher Commission suggested is that this student personnel ratio go up to about 20. How do you go to Iowa parents and tell them your kid is going to have to go to a larger class, and that's in the interest of better education?
Well, I'm not, first of all, I'm not sure the state ought to be setting a state ratio, because how can you have a ratio that's the same in a very sparse rural district compared to Des Moines Public Schools?
Well, one of the things they'll say is that's exactly what they're trying to do, is get rid of a lot of those little sparse school districts through this formula.
I think they've got the problem identified correctly. 85 to 90% of school district budgets are our personnel. So you cannot improve the quality of education in the state without looking at. However, that is not a teacher-to-student ratio, that 15 to 20 they're kicking around. That is a professional teaching staff to student. In other words, that's all your special ed, music, art, guidance counselors, all that serve students. So you're beginning to make priorities. Do we want to offer all those programs in our schools?
Why should an urban taxpayer whose children are in 1 to 30 ratios pay taxes to a school aid formula that subsidizes small school districts where the ratio is 1 to 15?
Well, I've said, and I've been quoted publicly on this many times, we have hundreds of classrooms across the state that have less than 10 kids in them, and most of those in our rural schools. So it is an issue of equity in the state, but there's also, you got to keep this in mind, you look across the country, the states that have the lowest staff-to-student ratio in the country are all rural states. And part of that is the issue of trying to deal with critical mass, and that's a struggle in Iowa.
Let me come at this from the standpoint of a rural parent. How many hours a day can a kid spend on a school bus?
Well, that's the issue. I mean, that's what we're struggling with, is how big can we get and not put kids too long. I mean, when I talk with rural people, most rural people that I talk to that are progressive about this, it's not an issue of whether they ought to consolidate. It's an issue of how far can they go and still get the critical mass.
What do you think about that? What is your
Well, I would give you, you know, the state board has on two different occasions, made recommendations about school district size. They talked about county units in one case. My own sense, and this is not magical because it's affected by geography, I think what is unfolding with how we fund schools, with what's happening with the technology, what's happening with the standards that we're requiring in schools, I think a school district today that's operating with less than 1,000 students is going to have a hard time maintaining themselves in the future, because if 1,000 students gives you at least 4 sections of a grade.
What's K through 12?
Yes, K through 12.
What's the future? 5 years, 2 years, 3 years? And you say a school district less than 1,000 is going to have a hard time maintaining itself in the future. Does that mean in 5 years there'll be no school districts under 1,000? In 10 years?
No, I think probably 10 years, and I think it depends upon where a school district is located. For instance, if it's a district that's located closer to a metropolitan area that's rural, is different than a school district in a very sparse rural area. That's why people that want to say there ought to be a county-like school system, that won't work in every case. I mean, there are some counties in southwest Iowa that are just too sparse.
One idea that's supposed to help rural school districts offer better programs is this fiber optic network, and yet it's very controversial. A lot of school administrators say they can't afford it. There's some question of whether the thing will be built. How do you come down on that? Do we need this, and how do we pay for it?
Iowa will lose its status as a national leader in education without that system. I am convinced that the school of the future in Iowa's ability to lead the nation is its ability to have technology classrooms that includes not only fiber optics, but the most advanced levels of sophisticated technology available. And we don't today. One teacher told me, he said, quit ringing the bell if you can't feed the dog. I think that's a pretty good analogy.
Speaking of feeding dogs, that means local property tax increases, doesn't it? How else are local schools supposed to pay for this?
My view is that we first have to decide what our view is for what we want our kids to have access to and be able to do. Once in the hearts and minds of Iowans that they believe that this is important to their children's education, then the cost will be answered. I can't answer that today because there's lots of ways that question be answered. I think for people to say we ought not to do it because it's going to cost this much, or this much, I don't know that a lot of that discussion is centered around what anybody really knows. The point is in some ways that fiber optic system is just like when we paved roads. That's the way we're going to provide high-quality, world-class education in rural Iowa. If we don't have it, we got to answer this controversy. We got to get it aside. It should not be a question of whether we have it or not. It's a question of how we're going to fund it and how we're going to implement it. I would suggest to you that most school administrators that say we can't afford this, it's because they don't understand yet what it can do for them. And once they understand that, they'll have a different response.
But the basic premise was, as Dave said, is to help smaller school districts provide instruction that they weren't able to hire the in-school instructor for.
Absolutely. We already have examples of that. In Fort Dodge, in Cedar Rapids, we have rural schools now that are offering multiple foreign languages that cannot do that without that kind of system
But if you're going to go to fewer schools and larger schools, then the instructor will be in the school, and why do you need the fiber optic network?
Well, we have Shenandoah and Clarinda just asked us to do a study. Both those school districts have more than 1,000 students each, K through 12. They asked us to do a study as to whether they ought to consolidate or not because they felt like they couldn't do all of the enrichment kind of programs and vocational education that's now emerging as a major policy issue. We told them they ought not to merge because of the geographic sparsity. What they ought to do is try to set up an instructional center that's where they could bring students together for some of these specialized programs. Now, some of those might be able to offer it if we had a telecommunication system that was accessible to them. That's the only way rural Iowa, from my point of view, is going to be able to have the capacity of world-class competing schools for their kids, so that their kids can live and work anywhere in the world.
Okay.
Talking about world-class, students in Japan spend a lot longer each day in school, and they go to school a lot longer in terms of days each school year. When will Iowa have a longer school year to be able to compete with Japanese students in the world market?
There's a lot of talk and a lot of interest, and it always stops on cost. I think we're almost getting past the issue of whether we need longer days and longer schools, but it always settles down to what is the cost. My argument is you can't answer that question until you answer the question of how many school districts are we willing to fund in this state, because we rank 37th or 38th in teacher salaries in this nation. You look at the highest per staff average salary in this state, and I'll guarantee if you take the top 5 salaries in any size category, you'll always see the largest staff-to-student ratio. The correlation's right there. So how much more money, how much more of the pie will Iowans spend on education? That's the issue that's in the framing in the debate today.
But Dr. Lepley, is that really the issue of whether Iowa schools need more money or a bigger slice of the pie? Isn't the issue rather, are you people, being Iowa educators, spending your slice of the pie wisely?
Well, I would suggest wisely is probably depending on program to program. I think we're spending it on to support Iowa's traditions.
You're spending it to support too many school districts. You yourself said that. You're spending it to support too many teachers, too many administrators, too many layers of bureaucracy. That's what's happening right now. How can you come back to the Iowa taxpayer and say, give us more money, when by your own admission, you're spending a lot of it badly?
I don't think I said we're spending it badly.
You said you're spending it on the wrong thing.
Well, I think I don't think it's a case of good or bad. I think it's a case of a changing environment. I mean, basically the 425 school districts replaced 2,000 school districts that we had in Iowa at one time when we had one-room schoolhouses. The shift is we're trying to respond to a changing environment. So I'm not willing to indict educators for what we've done. In fact, I would suggest to you that we didn't get to be first in the nation in education by accident. And so what I'm concerned about is how do we take us into this next century so that we don't lose that position. And part of that has to do with how we spend it currently. But at the same time, you can't have longer school years. You can't have technology in every classroom. You can't have fiber optic systems. You can't have teacher salaries that are better unless we're also willing to look at whether what we are spending now is enough.
David? One issue that will be in the legislature next year is whether the threshold for passing local school bond issues should be lowered from 60% to 50%. It will make it easier to build school buildings, but could conceivably raise property taxes a lot more. How do you come down on that question?
I'm consistent. I've been consistent about that from my very first day as a superintendent. If 51% of the people think that any issue ought to be endorsed in the local community, they ought to be able to do it. My concern is there's too many classrooms in this state, the infrastructure of this state's schools. There are classroom after classroom that may have one plug-in in it. Now, how in the world are you going to build a technology classroom where you got one electrical outlet?
Have you talked to your boss, the governor, about this?
I think the governor and I may disagree on this one, and
but he still keeps you around.
Well, you know, today at least, I think one of the reasons I enjoy working with this governor is he's given me freedom to speak as an educator. That's what my job is to do, is to speak to what I think is best for education. He is a governor. He's elected by the people. If he says that that's not what we're going to do, then he has to be accountable to the voters. I'm speaking from what I believe is good. You cannot have 21st century schools in Iowa unless we do something about the infrastructure. You drive across the state and look at the number of old schools and classrooms that are limiting teachers and administrators from doing the very best they can. Now, there are lots of solutions that people are throwing out there how we address that, and I think any one of those may have merits.
Mike, one of the things that's been talked about is the state budget squeeze, putting a lot of financial pressure on local governments, local school districts. One school district, you've already taken control of, the Hedrick district. How many more of those Hedricks are laying out there for the state to have to take over because they're going to go bankrupt?
Well, I think less than I would have said maybe when we were in the Hedrick situation, and I guess part of that is in the past, since that Hedrick situation, the flurry of activity of school districts to share or reorganize.
You think they got the message then?
I think they did. I think enough of them did.
In terms of finances out there, however, the state isn't being very accountable. It's not making school aid payments on time. Schools are dipping into their cash reserves. When do cash reserves run out and schools stop paying school teachers?
One of the misconceptions that the Fisher Committee and others, I believe, are in the state is that the school aid formula is the reason why we're in the financial condition we are. I would argue that a school aid formula does just exactly what the state wants to have happen. That is, it controls expenditure. People say, well, it's on automatic pilot. It's not on automatic pilot. It's basically built on the growth in school aid formula is tied directly to the state's growth. And I would suggest the other supplementals, the other aspects of the budget are the ones that are out of control, which is putting pressure on school aid payments, which therefore cause them to be delayed.
Dr. Lepley, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of Iowa school children who have been opted out of the public school system or being taught at home. How is that experiment working now that the law is in effect? It's no secret your department was not a big supporter of that change to allow students to be taught at home. Has it had the effect on the system that you thought it would?
Well, actually, that's not true, Mike. We proposed legislation to give parents to accommodate homeschool education.
Wasn't a big secret was that your department wasn't real eager to do it and may have proposed it under some pressure.
Well, I don't know what you mean by that. I think the pressure that I felt we were under is the fact that this issue needed resolve. It's been languishing around longer than I've been in office, and what it's got to the point is that basically we didn't know whether those kids were being educated out there because they went underground, because the state didn't address the issue. So our interest in it was not any pressure other than the fact we had to resolve it.
Are they being educated now?
They are being educated. In fact, that our enrollment growth this year was 8,000 students, and part of that growth was the allowance for the new formula for districts to count them as students, so therefore they're in school.
We've got just a few seconds. Do we need a tax increase to pay for more education?
Well, I guess my feeling is on that is that question ought to be answered when we decide what we want our future for schools to be like, and we haven't done that yet.
Thank you, Dr. Lepley, for being our guest today. Interesting conversation and a lot more to be said on that, and we're going to be hearing a lot more about it in the future. Next time in Iowa Press, we look to the busy business of Iowa state party politics. Richard Schwarm, chairman of Iowa's Republican Party, and John Rourke, who chairs Iowa's Democratic Party, will be with us. Topics, as you might imagine, will include an assessment of state house campaigns, congressional campaigns in a newly redistricted Iowa, and the shape of the upcoming Iowa caucuses. That's next Sunday in Iowa Press at noon and at 7 at night. And as we leave you with this edition, remind you that Iowa Press looks forward to hearing from you, too. Send your comments and your observations along with your program suggestions to letters to the editor, Iowa Press. The address is on your screen right now. The post office box is 6450, and the zip code in Johnston is 50131. And we may use all or part of your letter here on the Iowa Press. Until next time, I'm Dean Borg. Thanks for joining us today.
Today's edition of Iowa Press can be seen again this evening at 7. Now stay tuned to Iowa Public Television and join Louis Rukeyser for more news from the world of money on Wall Street Week.
Major funding for this program is provided by Friends of Iowa Public Television.
Next time on Frontline.
Our argument was not with the people of Iraq, but with this dictator.
It was a war against Saddam Hussein, but it was his people who paid the price.
The bombings knocked out the electricity, knocked out the water supply. Anywhere from 75,000 to 175,000 children could die due to the public health conditions.
The war we left behind on Frontline.
Tuesday at 8.
Hello, I'm Mark Russell, and for centuries, mankind has been pondering the question, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Songwriters are often asked, which comes first, the words or the music? I'm often asked, which came first, the politician or the joke? That's because on the Mark Russell Comedy Specials, I write words and music about politicians who lay eggs. And if they don't watch my show, they're chicken.
Tune in to Iowa Public